My name is Richard Price. I'm the founder of a company called Academia.edu, which is a startup based in San Francisco. I did my PhD in Oxford in philosophy a few years ago, and when I was finishing that, I kind of was noticing how inefficient the academic publishing system was and the ways in which academics communicate and share research. And I decided to found this company and move to Silicon Valley. And I raised about $6.5 million from venture capital firms, and here we are. So far we have about 1.8 million users, academics signed up, and we're at about 4,000 to 4,500 a day. It's a platform for academics to share research papers, and I'm going to spend a bit of this talk elaborating on that and explaining exactly what value the site provides to its users. And then I'm going to spend a bit of the talk talking about what our hopes and dreams and ambitions are for science and how we want to reshape science and make it a lot more efficient. So there are three main apps on the platform. The first app, is the profile, and here is Steven Pinker's profile page. As you can see, he's uploaded some books and some papers. On the right-hand side, there's a bunch of metrics associated with this profile that sort of reflect and quantify how much usage this profile is receiving, and generally quantify his online influence as an academic. One of the themes that I'm going to be talking about quite a lot in this talk is sort of credibility metrics, ways in which academics establish impact, reputation, and credibility. I think that's a very key theme in science. We have a whole app devoted to analytics and credibility metrics, and this gives you a sense of your own usage metrics on the site and how often your papers are downloaded, and you can see which sources are driving the most traffic to you, what keywords people are typing into search engines to find your page. The analytics app is a sort of mini Google Analytics for our researcher, so basically customized for their research output and for their content. There's a sort of geography tab where you can see traffic from countries and so on. So the third app, Profile Analytics, and the third app is our newsfeed. This is based on people you follow on the site, other academics you follow, and you get a feed of papers they published instantly. And another activity from them, such as status updates or questions they're asking. You can also follow topics on the site, and that means you get papers tagged with those topics. So if you upload a paper in DNA sequencing and tag it with that, it'll get distributed to the 3,000 or 4,000 people following that topic on Academia instantly. So that's a quick run-through of the core apps of Academia and what people get out of it, why they use it. I suppose one thing I should mention actually is one of the reasons obviously people use profile pages is it's the main shop window for your research these days. I mean, online is the main channel that people find your work. And so you want to have a very beautiful page that celebrates your work and it makes it easy for people to find and basically celebrates you as a researcher. The analytics side of things, why people use that, it's interesting how obviously it's sort of addictive to look at the stats, and it's one of the most popular, most accessed pages just because people check in every day and want to see who's searching for them and what countries are driving the traffic. But beyond the sort of personal gratification value proposition, there's actually also a professional role that the analytics page plays in a researcher's life. And we sort of document cases more and more like this, where users are taking screenshots of their analytics page and including them with their tenure track applications and their grant applications to establish that their work is being accessed and read. The reason they're doing this again speaks to a theme that's going to be quite dominant in this presentation, is that it's just extraordinarily competitive to get jobs and grants, and that from sort of running a site with almost 2 million academics signed up, that's something that comes through every single day, is just how unbelievably competitive it is. And when you're up for a grant or a job, it's just critical, really, to stand out from the other 200 people who've also got 5 peer-reviewed publications. And you really want to do as much as you can to add strings to your bow that make your application stand out from the noise. So those sort of competitive currents in science are extraordinarily powerful, and that's why people sort of print out these analytics dashboards, and you can actually export the data as a CSV file and just include that. It's another string to your bow, and it does have an impact. We also talked to the hiring committees and that side of the fence, and we noticed that increasingly they are seeing these metrics come through in their applications and are starting to look out for them. And I think that when it comes to introducing new credibility metrics in science, which I think is an absolute critical thing for achieving some of the things that I'm going to talk about next, you basically want to leverage a very, very strong current, a very, very strong sort of psychological current, and let that community, let that current sort of do the work for you in terms of achieving your goals. So if your goals are introduce new credibility metrics in science, you know, what we're doing, our approach is, instead of trying to persuade Harvard and Stanford and the institutions to change the way they evaluate research, instead we're empowering academics who have this strong need for funding and sort of need to stand out from the crowd. We empower them with tools to make their applications stand out, and they do the evangelizing for us. And for the community, they introduce these new metrics. And I think if you look at how citation counts, mainly on the back of Google Scholar, got adopted in the last 5-6 years as a sort of very credible impact metric. It's the same story. It's not Google Scholar going to universities. It's the academics saying, here are my citation counts. You should take account of these. And it's the community who drives the metrics. So I'm going to talk about where we want to take the site, and more broadly, what my hopes and dreams are for a future of science, which is a future of science which is a lot more efficient than, I think, where we are today. I think Tyler touched on a few points, the economics of publishing today, but I think there are a tremendous number of inefficiencies. I think many people think of science as vastly too slow and too one-dimensional, and I want to talk about how to fix that. So I think the first thing we want to introduce into science is instant distribution of ideas. If you submit a paper to a journal, the typical time lag between sending it to the journal and it coming out is 12 months. And if you compare that to what the sorts of distribution times that the web has enabled with Twitter and Facebook and WordPress and so on, and what we're doing with academia, it's unfathomable, that a piece of content, digital content, could take 12 months for it to just circulate around the world. And we all know what's going on in that 12 months, an extremely inefficient administrative process, an extremely inefficient peer review process. But broadly, it's just a very, very long time. And I mean, just imagine it taking sort of 12 months for a tweet to come out. It's literally unfathomable. None of these sites would exist in that sort of world. So a big goal, I think, for science as a whole, and certainly something we're working on, is how do we enable instant distribution so that when you post a paper, it's instantly available to everyone who might want to read it straight away. A second goal for academia that we want to achieve is multimedia. I think that many people have noticed that somehow the web has gone multi-dimensional, multimedia, and it's a very rich place for people to share ideas in different formats. But somehow science is still dominated by the scientific paper. The paper is the coin of the realm. And this leads to scientists not sharing a large part of their scientific output. Maybe as much as 50% of their scientific output remains private, just because the norms don't encourage the formats through which that output can be shared. So some obvious examples are things like data sets, the code that runs on those data sets, videos of various things, blog posts, different sort of textual formats, status updates, comments on all these sorts of media. I think it's really, really critical that we move beyond a single mode of publication to a much more multimedia format. I mean, I think probably data is the most important thing here. I mean, it's just unbelievable that when you read a paper, in a PDF form, and there's a table in there. It's not a machine-readable table, and it's a 0.1% of the data set that actually was used to power the paper. We need to move beyond that stage to a world where a reader can get their hands dirty and verify the conclusions of the paper with regard to the data set themselves. So instant distribution, multimedia. The third thing we want to achieve is open access. And the dream here is that, as I was saying earlier in a question, a villager in India should have the same access to the world's scientific output as a professor at Harvard. I think that right now about 10 million people around the world have access to the papers because they can afford the licenses. And I think magical things could happen if we open that up to 2.5 billion people who are online right now. One is it's just much better to have a scientifically educated population. Exposing those papers to the population, the people who've paid for it, is good from that perspective. I think also there are science sort of proceeds disproportionately by a few kind of leaps of genius that sort of occur when people like Einstein or Darwin turn up on the scene. And I think that there are obviously cases where there's a sort of budding genius in some high school in Japan or something, whose mind would be nurtured by having access to the world's greatest physics literature, but right now it's being held back. I think there are all kinds of serendipitous and to some degree unpredictable benefits that would come from opening up research, but just the numbers are very powerful. Changing the audience from 10 million to 2.5 billion is very powerful. So peer review, I think the main problem with peer review right now is that it takes a long time, and at the end of the 12-month process, you only get the opinions of 2 people, which really is not a representative sample size as far as eliciting from the scientific community what the scientific community thinks. 2 people is just not enough. They may be biased. They may be too lazy to do a good review. They might not be experts, or they might just be in a bad mood when they're reviewing their paper. In general, one fact that is true for basically all peer reviews is that the reason they take 12 months is that there's no real incentive to do them quickly. It's sort of 150 on your list of priorities as a peer review, and I'm as guilty as that as anyone. I mean, I peer review for a number of journals, and I understand that psychology and where the people are coming from. I think we need to move to a world where you can surface the reviews and the opinions from the entire scientific community and in real time, rather than waiting 12 months. I think that peer review is going to somewhat similar to the theme I was talking about earlier, with the sort of modes of publication being very one-dimensional historically, and I think in the future it'll be multi-dimensional. I think the same goes for peer review. It's been very one-dimensional historically, largely in a way, which is 2 anonymous peer reviewers at a journal. There are obviously other kinds of peer review, which is just colleagues' recommendations serendipitously handed to you over lunch at your department. That is definitely a kind of peer review. It's your peers recommending content, but it hasn't happened at scale, and so it's more informal. I think in the future there will be many forms and many ways in which you can extract sentiment and extract recommendations from the community. And if you look at one of the useful analogies here that I use when trying to predict how this is going to pan out is just looking at how discovery happens on the web. Peer review, or the role that peer review plays in a scientist's life when they're deciding what to read, is just a discovery problem. You're trying to discover what to read and how to separate the wheat from the chaff. And if you look at how the web solved that problem, there's a whole family of signals that people use to decide what to read. I mean, some people, the 2 big channels on the web at large are obviously search engines is a huge part of it in terms of discovery, and social networks is a huge part of it. Those collectively account for probably 80% of the discovery of content on the web. And they're both peer review systems, and they're both discovery systems. In the social case, obviously, you're surfacing opinions in real time from a large number of friends. And in the search engine case, no one had really thought before Larry Page came along that in something as humble and mundane as a hyperlink could you extract a peer review signal? You can take the link structure of the web and find sentiment there. It's a very unusual place to find sentiment, but that's where he found that. It's obviously very powerful. So I think that the reason I was mentioning that is I think people will find sentiment in unusual places, and especially when there's tons and tons of data to play with. I think it's going to be very unpredictable. I think there are some obvious things that will mirror the way the web has solved the discovery problem so far, which is that obviously search engines is a big way that people find research, and the link structure and the citation structure will be one way that people extract sentiment, peer review sentiment. Another angle is certainly colleagues' recommendations. That's something that we're focusing on Academia, is what are all my colleagues reading around the world right now. I think, so I did my PhD in philosophy. If I could find what the top 100 philosophers in the world are reading right now, today, that would basically be my journal. That would be my reading list. So getting those recommendations to work at scale, and also getting commenting to work at scale, so you can see which papers are attracting the most comments. I see that as a kind of real-time peer review process. So those are the 4 things that we'd like to achieve: instant distribution, multimedia, open access, and a more robust and agile peer review system. I think that there are one major theme that runs through these slides and runs through my thinking about the future of science and how to achieve it is, I think, credibility metrics are the fulcrum on which science is going to change and science is going to pivot. Credibility metrics are the main driver of scientific behavior. I mean, when I'm talking to non-scientific audiences, I often, such as journalists or venture capitalists or engineers who are recruiting, I often point out that in the outside world, people think of scientists as altruistic people who are kind of dispassionately pursuing something for the research for the common good, and that really couldn't be farther from the truth. It's an intensely competitive environment where you have to be thinking about what ways in which your publications and ways in which your activities contribute to your resume and how they'll impact on your prospects for grants and for jobs down the line. So, for instance, if you ask a scientist, why don't you share your data set? As a publicly funded piece of output, it would obviously help the community. Why don't you share it? I mean, it doesn't take that long to curate it and stick it online. You'll typically hear the response, well, I don't get any credit for it on my resume. I mean, if it's a line item on my resume, the grant committee doesn't appreciate that in any way. It doesn't give me any kind of credibility or impact associated with that. So the result is that the incentives aren't there and the work doesn't get done. I think that is the key thing to change. I think that if you want instant distribution, if you want new forms of peer review or multimedia being shared in science, I think if you give scientists the incentives, ways in which they can demonstrate that their data sets have had impact, they have been downloaded, have been used, have been recommended, they will include that with their applications just because of the need to stand out. They will just do that naturally. And then the grant committees will see, gosh, I see this data set was not only uploaded, but in fact it had quite a significant impact. So I think that it's something we're very, very focused on at Academia, is how to introduce new credibility metrics into science and how those are going to power the sort of various goals and achieve the various goals we want to. So thanks. It's good to be here. It's great to see an ecosystem of startups emerging in science. I think Elizabeth raised a question earlier about who's the main driver of this future. Is it funders or someone else? And I actually think it's someone else. It's the startup ecosystem. Like Tyler, I've had quite a lot of interaction with the NIH and the White House and the UK government about advancing the cause of open access and advancing science. And it's very slow. It's extremely fraught with lobbying, especially by institutions and companies that have vastly bigger and deeper pockets than you do. And at the end of the day, politicians have other agendas that they're pursuing and other things that fit into the election cycle. And progress is is quite depressingly slow. For instance, it took about 5 years for the NIH to get the first mandate through. It's just too long. We don't have 5 years to wait. A lot of the world's innovation depends on science and depends on science speeding up. And I just think that the people who are really changing science are the startups. They're the ones who are taking the products, providing the products directly to the community. And the community is responding and saying, I want to use Academia.edu, I want to use Math Overflow, I want to use archive.org. And that's how these products get adopted. I think there is a role for funders, but I just feel the role for startups are much more agile, and funding is flowing into the space from the venture capital community. So to encourage anyone to raise that money, build those products, and take them to the community. We're hiring engineers, so come and chat to me about that or anything else afterwards.
Hey, Rich, how's it going? So I think it's a really great idea to take the site engagement metrics that people use and apply this in an academic context. It certainly makes a lot of sense, and great to see another, more work being done in the general overall alt metrics sort of space. One of the things I'm wondering is if you are self-selecting your reviewers through a crowdsourced peer review system, how do you get around the whole issue of that Wikipedia faces, like with these edit clicks and things like that?
Yeah, I think that's a sort of part of a family of problems associated with how to manage an online community. One other related problem is how do you distinguish between popularity and real impact? Is it just a sort of numbers game? And I think that every site faces that issue, and there are kind of fairly established solutions to it. Google's probably got the most famous solution to the problem, which is just using a recursive algorithm. That's something that just reflects how we think day to day. When you get a recommendation from a paper, from a colleague for a paper, obviously you take into account who's recommending the paper to you. You don't just say, oh, +1. You say, Steven Pinker recommended that to me. That's a pretty big deal, versus some grad student. And I think that there's absolutely no doubt. And the existing peer review system also takes into account the identity of the reviewer. Nature only asks certain sort of prestige, certain sort of level of professors to do the peer review work. I think that, the way you'll see that happen at scale is algorithms that work in a recursive PageRank kind of way. They will look at the value of the recommender. So Steven Pinker's recommendations and general activity will obviously count more in the network than someone who has less impact. I think specifically to your question about edit cliques, there's an analogy there again with Google, which is, despite the fact that it has this very sophisticated PageRank recursive algorithm, there are still these sort of web spam cliques in various parts of the world that try to spam PageRank. And again, they have a spam team. I think whenever you have a credibility metric and you're running a credibility metric, people will obviously game it, and you need to be on top of you need to be on top of that. You need to be smarter than them. It can be done. It has been done. Every single community site that has this sort of metric has dealt with it, and some more successfully than others. But Google is probably the leading example there.
Thanks.
Hi, Richard. I'm Manish Junaid. I've just quit my job in GSK, and I'm pursuing my dream of opening up access to patient data. I applaud you on your presentation and your commitment to following your dreams. My question for you is, before I left GSK, I started using ResearchGate, which I believe Luke Nosek, who founded PayPal, he's back now. He's taken a share in that. How do you see your positioning compared to something like ResearchGate and other tools that are out there?
Yeah. So ResearchGate is slightly more focused on, it's a German company. It's definitely in the same broad space. It's more focused on discussion rooms than it is on papers. Our academia is very focused on papers and analytics and usage analytics around those papers. And the news feed is basically dominated by papers, whereas ResearchGate is mainly about trying to get discussion going.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Richard.
Tim McCormick, Stanford Media X. My question is, I noticed that despite the name Academia.edu, you're really talking only about science. And I'm wondering if you've made a sort of deliberate decision to make that your scope, or that's where you found the market to be, or whether the assumption is that sort of science is a stand-in for how all of academia works.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess one sort of just semantic quibble. I mean, I just generally mean science is synonymous with research. So yeah, Academia.edu is focused on the whole of research. But going beyond the semantics, I mean, it is true that the vast majority of funding, obviously, in research goes to science, the hard sciences. Of the $200 billion a year that comes from governments into the academic science world, the absolute vast majority is into sort of the hard sciences. So it's the bulk of the market.
Good morning. Hi, I'm Llewellyn Cox from USC. Thank you for this talk. It's a really laudable thing you're really trying to do. I have a kind of question about peer review. So someone who had experience of taking over 3 years to publish a paper, one of the problems, as you know, with current peer review is it has a bit of a problem with things that go against the grain of conventional thinking. And I have a concern that as laudable as the process is of going to more open peer review, that if we source opinions from everyone, we could actually double down on this problem that mainstream thinking tends to be followed at the expense of disruptive ideas. So I wonder how you feel about how we can through an open peer review system still make sure that ideas that go against conventional thinking get out into the world and have real impact.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Although I happen to think that the future lies in the other direction, which is I think that it's going to be easier with a richer and faster communication system. I think it's going to be easier for more niche ideas and more adventurous ideas to get validation. And the reason for that is that if you sort of if you look at why the NIH is accused of being quite conservative in its funding decisions, the same, by the way, is true of pretty much any funder. I mean, if you look at the venture capital community, you'll find, the majority of VCs are sort of accused of being sheep, basically. They follow what's already been validated, and they don't, only a small minority of them will go out on a limb and say, I'm going to back this crazy idea called Twitter, even though everyone thinks it's dumb. Or, Facebook, even though, social networking clearly never going to work, and so it's a general problem in the funding community. I think that one way in which you might try to kind of alleviate the problem, improve the situation, is when you are, if you're going to the NIH with some crazy grant proposal that's like quite off the wall and quite new, and the grant committee has never heard of it, and is inclined to reject it just on those grounds because it's too much of a risk for them to put their money behind. If you can just show some validation, that generally there's sort of some bubbling in the research community beyond your own application. There's some bubbling in the research community worldwide that reflects some interest, some growing interest in this. Then they might just be able to say, well, in fact, this is not just one crazy guy. There's actually a broader trend. And I think just having the data online, the reading data, the usage data of research online, will surface some of these more nascent infant trends. And that can power some more adventurous thinking.
So yeah, I'd really like to see more surfacing of these kinds of signals. Along those lines, are you planning to make some of these site engagement metrics that you're collecting available, or are people going to have to come to your site to get those?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it actually speaks to a larger question, which is, where are the economics in the future of science? I mean, I'm of the view that in the future, the participants in the scientific community are not going to be paying for research. The readers won't be paying, which is the current model, and I don't even believe in the author pays model. I think it's just insane that it costs $4,000 to distribute a piece of digital content around the web, when in the case of a blog post, which is just as complex from a sort of information theoretic perspective, it's completely free. To distribute. And you could say, well, there's peer review involved, but the reality is, as we all know, peer review is not doesn't get paid. The peer reviews aren't paid, so it's not actually an input cost to the system. So, I'm of the view that in the future, the core distribution of content is going to be free. And the question therefore arises, how do you monetize science? How do you monetize scientific communication? Our views on that are that, I think there are going to be, just as you found with other highly disruptive technologies, you found the companies like Google and Facebook and so on, which are sort of native web technologies, monetize in ways that wouldn't have been predicted before the web, and so they weren't even predicted by their founders. It wasn't, Larry Page didn't know that CPC, cost per click, would be the main revenue driver for Google, and similarly Mark Zuckerberg didn't realize that the platform would be such a main driver of revenue for Facebook, and still he's figuring it out, right? As we could all see, they're figuring out their revenue model. I think that data may well be one part of how sites like Academia monetize in the future. I think that right now you have this bridge between the R&D world, which spends about $800 billion a year on R&D, and the academic world, which spends about $200 billion a year on R&D. And the sort of the narrative of why that $200 billion gets spent is that governments obviously spend it because they think that the R&D community, the R&D companies will productize it. It's not just money into the ether. They expect that at some point in the future, a longer future than most private capital is interested in, which is why they invest in it, not companies. These research ideas will get productized. That bridge will deliver on the bridge between the academic world and the R&D world will deliver on its promises, and there's a flow of ideas there. My personal view is that bridge right now is extraordinarily inefficient. I don't think people have a strong sense of, from a data perspective, of what papers are trending in real time around the world. If you said, of all the, gene therapists around the world, right now, what are the trending papers in that theme in the last 24 hours or 7 days? That data is not online yet. It's still in the offline world where people are reading the papers in their labs, and that is not tracked. I think when that data comes online, it's going to give some quite extraordinary data mining opportunities on the level of, say, what Google did with the link structure of the web to extract sentiment, to track trending sentiment, real-time sentiment about science. I think R&D companies who deploy $800 billion a year will may be able to make more efficient capital decisions based on a more data-driven decision-making model. Getting that data, I think, is critical. I think every decision in the future is obviously, when you can get data, it's better to have a data-informed decision. And so to answer your question, William, I think some data will be public and some will be part of our business model.
Okay, but we shouldn't expect an API or an integration with altmetrics aggregators like Impact Story at any time?
Oh, no, for sure, yeah. API is actually something we're working on. Yeah.
Okay, but it'll probably be, there'll be a licensing fee associated?
No, it'll be free. I think that they're just, as I said, like some aspect. The API will be a generic API that'll allow you to sort of, push and pull from the site. But there'll be some data that we hold back.
But you're going to keep the metrics back? Probably.
I think, as I said, some metrics will be exposed. As you already saw from the profile page, like some are exposed, and some will be part of our business model. And we're going to have to figure out that balance.
Okay, thanks.
One of the goals that you had mentioned was multimedia presentation for scientific data and theory and such. Something that comes to mind is, I'm not terribly familiar with Academia.edu, is what relation will that have to linked data and the semantic web specifically?
I think they're not. They're fairly orthogonal in the sense that one could work without the other. I don't have any particularly strong views about the semantic web other than hoping that it will come to fruition at some point, and it's presumably quite a gradual road. I think that it's something which applies to the more general web and isn't just of scientific interest, and so I suspect it'll get driven and validated in the general web case, and hopefully science will be be able to benefit from that too.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, David J., founder of journallab.org. I know I've been talking with people at PLOS who've said that there's a lot of strengths and a lot of limitations to access metrics as means of measuring a paper's impact. you have papers that are really popular in sort of get media attention and then get a lot of downloads, but it's not necessarily an indication that they're contributing to scientific dialogue. And you also, a lot of times it is an indication that's contributing to scientific dialogue. What do you see as the greatest strengths and weaknesses of tracking views and downloads as an impact metric, and what are ways that you want to build beyond that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, that does sort of, just sort of touch on something I sort of mentioned earlier about how, it is important to distinguish between popularity and impact. And probably the most effective way of doing that is via this sort of recursive algorithm about, who read the paper, who downloaded the paper and read it, as an important weight to put into the algorithm. But it's also worth noting that before we sort of get to that world of a sort of perfect recursive algorithm on this data, I mean, I think to do it, obviously, you need identity. I mean, it's critical to have, who actually read this paper, who actually recommended it. And that's why I think identity is a really key part of peer review. And identity is very much part of the academia platform. But it's also worth noting that something, like if you take citations, okay, citation counts, inbound citation counts, they are also, they're not recursive. A citation from Stephen Hawking is worth as much as a citation from a grad student. At least in the kind of, the way Google Scholars presents citations and the way they play a role in decision making. I definitely don't think that's a perfect world. I think it's somewhat ironic, actually, that Larry Page got the idea for his recursive algorithm precisely from citations. He was meditating on the concept of citations and how they reflect impact in the structure of papers, and came up with this analogy for the web. And it's ironic that we're still in a world where on Google Scholar, citation counts are actually not recursive. They're just like a raw count. But the point I'm really trying to make is that even despite the fact that it's kind of V1 of these sorts of metrics, they still are useful. If you look at the adoption of citation metrics in hiring decisions and grant decisions in the last few years, there's this absolutely extraordinary rise. And the reason for that is that when you're on a grant committee or a hiring committee, it's extraordinarily difficult. I mean, I don't know, I'm sure many of you have been on these committees, but it's extraordinarily difficult to make these decisions. I mean, you get 200 people with somewhat similar resumes, and you've got to somehow make a decision. And I've been on these committees for quite a few years at Oxford, and have watched how challenging it is to make these subjective judgments and discriminations between these resumes. And you just hope for more data. You really, really are hungry for more data as a hiring committee. And obviously, it's sort of caveat emptor. Okay, so you have to understand how the metric is being gamed. Or potentially being gamed before you wield that metric properly. But there is a hunger for data. And it's also worth reflecting that the journal system is not without bias either. For instance, the concept of defensive citation is probably well known to everyone, whereby, to maximize your chances of being accepted by a journal, you will defensively cite every single scientist who might conceivably read your paper. And that sort of practice does infect citation metrics. It also infects the sort of journal title credibility metric. And, caveat emptor, you have to be aware of that. So I think that, it's true for any metric.